Hi, everybody. So this is chapter 5, Life in the Greenhouse. I'm still using the 6th edition slides because I made a mistake, but we're using the 5th edition book, and I'll be switching slides soon. At some point, I figured it out. So yeah, let's get going. So this particular chapter is all about climate change and photosynthesis. Um, and the learning outcomes. You want to know the difference between greenhouse effect and climate change, and the relationship, because those two terms often get used interchangeably, but they're really not the exact same thing. Um, the effect of fossil fuels on climate change, and then we want you to be able to explain how photosynthesis works, um, and then what happens. Okay, so you got photosynthesis, but then how does that relate to respiration, which is what we learned in the last chapter. And then the last thing is ways of reducing climate change. So the greenhouse effect, and this is their prompt question. Most scientists disagree that global climate change is occurring. So that's patently false. Scientists have been saying for a very long time that global climate change is happening. And it's not a belief. It's not a, something where that you have to subscribe to. It's scientists, following the process of the scientific method and making observations and observing that our climate is changing. And so what does this mean? So let's sort out those terms. Remember, global climate change and the greenhouse effect, those terms get used as if they're the same, but they're not. So what is global climate change? It's the change of the average temperature, precipitation, and sea levels. And this is relative to historical conditions, and we're going to talk about how we know that. And it's happening all over Earth. Global climate change, I just made that bigger. Global warming is the increase of Earth's average temperature. So global warming is the increase of average temperature, but let's go back. Climate change is a change in temperature locally. It could be wildly hot summers and wildly cold winters. It doesn't mean that your winters are getting warmer all the time. It could be droughts. It could be more rain. It could be different rain patterns, like, what would usually be a seasonably wet season. Wow, that a usually wet season is now, drier, and the wet season gets moved to a different time of year or different month. Sea levels are rising, whereas other places, lakes are drying up. For example, the Great Lakes are drying up. And so the global warming is contributing to that. And this is, again, this is not opinion. It's not, something to be subscribed to or convinced to. This is happening. It's happening. And so what's causing it? Anthropogenic means human caused. So you're probably not surprised. Humans are the cause of global warming and global climate change. Humans are dramatically causing this problem. And it's more than just some other things. And this could be very hard for us in the future. We already don't have enough farmable land to feed the Earth's population. And this is certainly going to cause problems to that. Energy, the disparity between people who can afford to heat and cool their homes versus those who can't. All of these things may be hard for humans to adjust to. So what is causing this anthropogenic global warming? Water vapors, carbon dioxide. That's the big one. That's the one that everybody contributes to global climate change, and it definitely is. One that you might not know is methane. Methane has 19 times the global warming potential as carbon dioxide. So methane's actually much stronger. And where does this come from? It comes from burning stuff, burning trees, burning leaves, but also, and probably more importantly, coal, oil, and natural gas. So how does this greenhouse effect work? Well, it's called the greenhouse effect because it's likened to a greenhouse. So a greenhouse is a building in which you grow plants, and it has this glass walls and roof, or it might be like a hoop house where you have these, curved supports with a plastic covering. And what happens is the sun's rays come through that covering, and in this case, the covering of Earth is not plastic or glass. It's those things: carbon dioxide, water vapors, and methane. And the heat bounces back off the Earth, and it gets trapped in those. So just like it gets trapped in a greenhouse or a hoop house, it's getting trapped in those gases. And because those gases are getting thicker or more concentrated, the amount of heat that's bouncing back towards Earth and not escaping out into space is increasing. And that's why it's getting warmer here. Yeah, so they likened it to sleeping under a blanket. So the greenhouse effect is necessary, right? Like if all the heat escaped from Earth, then we would just be an ice planet. But the problem is that not enough heat is escaping at this point. So the greenhouse effect is not necessarily a bad thing. It's the fact that because of this thickening or increased concentration, we are experiencing a greater greenhouse effect. We don't have that beautiful balance that we used to have. So let's talk about carbon, because carbon dioxide and methane are greenhouse gases. And so carbon naturally, has this cycle in Earth. You've got, remember, in all our macromolecules, all our organic molecules, carbon is the first thing, right? You have to have carbon hydrogen bonds, and it's CHNOPS: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, etc. So carbon, the word we use is sequestered, trapped, or being held to Earth in things like water, soil, plants, animals. All organic things are holding carbon here on Earth. We are composed of carbon. But there's also, of course, carbon in the atmosphere. And there is, I'm trying to think of an appropriate word. There is an acceptable amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because some things require carbon dioxide for life. But also remember that greenhouse gas is a balance. It's just that carbon in the atmosphere is increasing. Oh, so here we go. True or false? Most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is from natural processes. So at this point, right, I just said it's increasing. So that's false. Most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is coming from burning things. So yeah, carbon dioxide can be sequestered or brought back down out of the atmosphere by our photosynthesizers. And we're going to talk about that. Certainly, then it ends up into animals by us consuming those photosynthesizers, either directly or indirectly. But the problem is that some of that stuff, okay, so let's go back. Unconsumed carbohydrates, so unconsumed carbon, can get buried. And when it's buried and trapped, it can be harvested as what we call fossil fuels. So that's really highly concentrated energy. Fossil fuels are petroleum, coal, and natural gas. And when you've got this really rich carbon source, and then you burn it for things like powering your house or driving your cars or operating factories, it gets released. And it's carbon that has been sequestered or stored for like forever. And now suddenly it's just being belched into the atmosphere at this astronomical rate. And here we go. So just from the 1960s, from the industrial age on, the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere is just steadily increasing. How do we know that it's increasing? Like, how do we know, like this starts at the 60s, right? So like humans could just be recording this, but how do we know even before the 60s? Scientists take ice cores where air bubbles have been trapped, and they sample deep in the ice, and the layers of ice are like the layers of an onion. The newest stuff is on the outside and the oldest stuff is farther down, and they can sample those air bubbles, and they can measure the amount of carbon dioxide that was in the air back when those bubbles were trapped. And wow, has the carbon dioxide just absolutely shot through the roof. Like, I wish that we could zoom, like you can look at this red line and you can see it's fluctuated. And this is like the highest it has ever been by a long shot. I wish that we could zoom in on this, because this is definitely humans. This is a human effect. And I'm not going to make you watch a video. You're already watching a video. So they propose this question: can photosynthesis slow down global climate change? Let me just go back here, because there was a little something in here. Notice that like the carbon dioxide level has this sawtooth where it goes up and down, and that's because photosynthesis decreases in the winter. So the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere goes up. But as you can see, like just in general, it's already going up. So, even in the summer, we're where it would be lower on the sawtooth. We're not making up for the fact that we just keep dumping carbon dioxide into the air. So I'm just going to tell you, the answer to this is no. We can't count on plants. We can't go plant a bunch of trees and call it good, but we're going to talk about that. But because this particular book is written in a way of trying to teach concepts in order to answer questions, kind of this, what they call just-in-time teaching, this is the place where we're going to learn about photosynthesis. So photosynthesis has two words: photo and synthesis. And so I'm just going to tell you, it's really short and easy. The photo stands for light, and the synthesis stands for synthesizing glucose. So what happens in photosynthesizers is they take light enough to make energy. They make ATP from that light energy, and they use it to make glucose from carbon dioxide. So when we learned about respiration, we took food and we broke down the food, and we used that little bit of energy in order to make ATP. And then we took that ATP and we used it for cell movement and building up cell components and things like that. In this case, we're taking light instead of food, and we're using that energy to make ATP. And then we're taking that ATP and we're using it to build up glucose. So in plants, this happens, plants and algae in eukaryotes. This happens in that membrane-bound organelle called a chloroplast. Bacteria do this differently, but the principle is pretty much the same thing. So you've got this membrane-bound organelle, and remember, a membrane only water and uncharged molecules can pass through there, and so that's important for us because, again, we've got ATP synthase, and protons are charged, and so protons can only pass through that membrane if they go through ATP synthase, and we use that waterfall effect of pushing those hydrogens through ATP synthase to make ATP from ADP. So it's a proton motive force, again, just like it was in the electron transport chain. But in this case, and we use the same enzyme, in this case, we use light in order to push those protons on the other side of the membrane. So what happens is light strikes an enzyme that has chlorophyll in it, and it energizes the chlorophyll molecule enough to spit out an electron. And when it spits out that electron, it uses that to break hydrogen off of, I'm sorry, it spits out that electron and it uses that to make NAD, which goes off into another place. And in order to recharge that electron onto chlorophyll, we have to split hydrogen off of water, and we have to split the electron off of hydrogen. So that's really convenient because we're replenishing the chlorophyll, and now we're creating those protons, which makes that proton motive force. This is where in all the science classes when I was growing up, we were told that plants make oxygen. This is where oxygen is generated because the light strikes the chlorophyll enough to make it spit out an electron, make NADPH. And in order to recharge that electron, they have to take the hydrogen off of water, split the hydrogen into a proton and an electron, and it leaves behind the oxygen. So it makes oxygen gas. And then we've got those protons again, like I said, and you get the proton motive force, you get that waterfall effect to make ATP. So chlorophyll, yep, that's the light absorbing molecule. Plants use chlorophyll, and some algae use chlorophyll. There are other light absorbing molecules. Not all photosynthesizers use chlorophyll. Some algae use different colors, and bacteria use a different molecule. But generally, what's going to happen is you take that energy and you use that ATP that was made in order to synthesize glucose from carbon dioxide. So you've got the light dependent reactions where you make the ATP, and then you've got the light independent reactions, and that's called the Calvin cycle. Okay, so I explained that, did that a little early. So once you've made the ATP, here, you've made it, then what do you do with that energy? You use that to synthesize glucose from carbon dioxide. So this is how we pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Photosynthesizers take that single carbon molecule, and it's going to take a lot of energy to join it with 5 other carbons in order to make that glucose ring, which is 6 carbons. And so they spend that ATP energy by building glucose, sugar from carbon dioxide. And this is the way that carbon gets sequestered in photosynthesizers and plants. And then when we eat that, right, just like we do in our respiration, we eat that and we use that to make ATP. Yeah, so that's the version from your book. You don't have to know this exact version. I just liked this version better than the one from your book. It didn't really explain, the fact that you've got 1 carbon and you have to shove 5 more carbons on, and that takes energy to make the 6 carbon molecule. You definitely don't need to know these fancy terms. Ribulose bisphosphate, so fancy. Okay. Which molecule is a final product of the light independent reaction? That is glucose, right? Light independent. So this happens without it. Now, this is really important. You got a photosynthesizer and they have made glucose, but did they make energy in order to fuel the rest of the cell components, right? Cell movement, membrane transport, building up the rest of the cell. What do they do with that glucose? They respire it just like we do. They use light energy to make the glucose, and then they respire that glucose in order to make a lot more ATP. So the ATP that they make from the light reactions is not enough ATP to run the rest of the cell. So they do both. Plants respire just like we do. And there's another video. We're not going to do a video in a video. So moving on. Okay, so anthropogenic climate change, right? More severe weather. I mentioned this, right? Unprecedented droughts, torrential rains. Like it's not global warming. Like, you know, suddenly I can start wearing flip-flops in January in Michigan. But instead, the weather is just much more extreme, and it's shifting, and it's shifting faster than it had been naturally. We're getting melting of glaciers and rising of sea levels, and this is affecting more than just us. And this kind of stuff is going to affect us indirectly and in a huge way. When we start losing habitat for particular animals, we're going to start losing major components of the food chain. We're going to have increased spread of diseases, and we're going to start having problems with things that were already sequestering carbon dioxide. So algae, they would be sequestering carbon dioxide, and we would also have dissolved carbon dioxide in the water. And if it's not trapped there, it's going to be in the atmosphere. It's just worse makes worse. But honestly, who's the biggest culprit for the most carbon dioxide emissions for countries? Industry. Industry is the biggest culprit. Yep, they're the ones. So this is a very American-centric set of data, but the problem is that Americans are one of the bigger culprits as well. So our industries are contributing to a quarter of the carbon dioxide emissions, but we are only 4% of the people on Earth. That is a hugely disproportionate contribution. Our carbon footprint is way bigger than other places. And our biggest source is industry. Transportation. We don't have a good infrastructure. You know, people drive to work instead of taking buses or trains. All of our goods are transported on semi trucks instead of by trains, and definitely commercial residential issues, you know, running the AC nonstop and things like that. So yes, you can decrease your personal carbon footprint, and here are some ways. You know, carpool, get an energy efficient car, recycle, although you might want to read some data about recycling, walking instead of driving. You know, if you can live in the city limits instead of being price pointed out of the city. High efficiency appliances, certainly yes. You know, if you can afford to buy those. Buying recycled stuff, this is one, you know, like industries aren't going to make this stuff if we're not buying it. So yeah, it probably costs more. Sometimes you have to do your research on this though. and really dig into that. Push more instead of lawnmower. So some of these things are really kind of piddly. Planting trees, that actually does double duty, right? Plant a tree, so you're sequestering carbon, but then you're also shading your home if you have a beautiful home like this with an attached garage. Honestly, I'm just going to say here, this is really nice. These are ways that you can personally do it, but I think if industry is the most emissions, what we really have to do is we have to do two things. We have to look at our governmental policies, our local, state, federal policies when it comes to climate change. And we have to demand that the people that represent us actually represent us and our wants and needs for controlling industrial emissions. And the industry has dollars, right? And they're heartless and they have seemingly bottomless pockets for lobbying. And so we have to be pretty active about making sure that our voices are heard there, both with speaking up and making demands and watching them and making sure that they're doing what they say they're going to do. And then, of course, voting accordingly. And then the second thing is we have to prepare to be somewhat uncomfortable. I know that sounds crazy, but like if switching to windmills is going to cut our carbon emissions enormously, but we have to deal with, maybe not having a beach because there's a windmill offshore or there's a windmill in your neighbor's field. We have to kind of deal with being a little bit uncomfortable about that. That may not be ideal, but um, you know, we're going to be far more uncomfortable if we don't. So it may not be ideal at first, but it was less than ideal decisions that got us here. So we're going to have to take radical action to get out of it. Okay, greenhouse effect is necessary, but the greenhouse effect is what is contributing to climate change. And changes in the greenhouse effect is causing climate change. The burning of fossil fuels is the #1 culprit. Photosynthesis, the photo is using light energy to synthesize glucose, one of the products, glucose from carbon dioxide. One of the byproducts in that is oxygen is released. Remember that photosynthesizers still respire that glucose. And then the last thing is ways that you can reduce climate change. And without being too what they call standing on a soapbox and kind of shouting your opinion, I hope that you have some ideas there. So I'm going to end the video now. This is the end of chapter 5.